The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site. We'll own it. Level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job. Do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years. We'll own it.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Anselone Show. We have a massive episode today. Of course, we are talking about Trump's remarks as he's standing next to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, declaring that the United States is going to complete the ethnic cleansing of Gaza on behalf of Israel. This is the whole press conference, the whole day was absolutely crazy. It was actually a set of two press conferences, a series of photo ops between Trump and Netanyahu. This man comes to the United States, a wanted war criminal. The International Criminal Court has an arrest warrant out for his arrest. And yet he's welcomed in the United States in such, high honors, greeted in the most celebratory fashions. I'm sure millions and millions of dollars spent, American tax dollars spent on this event for all the security and operations, and then all the photo ops and everything else that goes along with it. And for Trump to use that opportunity to announce that he would be, it seems at this point they are talking about removing all the Palestinians from Gaza on behalf of Israel, and then the United States building something there is deeply, deeply disturbing. So let's go ahead and jump right in and play the first clip from Donald Trump yesterday with Netanyahu.
Think might accept Palestinians from Gaza?
Well, I think Jordan and Egypt will. I know they've spoken about it with you, and they say they're not going to accept. I say they will. But I think other countries will accept also. I think that Gaza maybe is a demolition site right now. If you look at Gaza, there's hardly a building standing, and the ones that are going to collapse. You can't live in Gaza right now, and I think we need another location. I think it should be a location that's going to make people happy. You look over the decades, it's all death in Gaza. This has been happening for years. It's all death. If we can get a beautiful area to resettle people permanently in nice homes and where they can be happy and not be shot, not be killed, not be knifed to death like what's happening in Gaza. And right now you have in Gaza a very dangerous situation in terms of explosives all over the place, in terms of tunnels that nobody knows who's in the tunnel. The whole thing is a mess. And I think that if we can resettle, and I believe we can do it in areas where the leaders currently say no. I've been saying that with Mexico, having to do with the border and all of the things, and you saw what happened, 10,000 soldiers, and they're going to do a good job. I really believe that, and I believe Canada is going to do a good job also. And they said the same thing, and then they did something much different than what you were hearing. This is a very, very difficult situation, but we're going to get it solved.
So in that statement, I think Trump makes two really important points. And the first one he made at the start and at the beginning, which is that we are going to force other countries to take in the Palestinians. And he compares this to what happened with Canada and Mexico, and I'm sure also emboldened by the situation with Colombia, where Trump was able to threaten economic penalties, tariffs on these countries, sanctions, things like that, and then was able to extract some minor concessions. And so Mexico is deploying 10,000 troops to the American border. Colombia was willing to take back their migrants that were arrested and deported from the United States. But what he's asking Jordan and Egypt and other Middle Eastern states to do is a much, much bigger ask. It's not only taking in these Palestinians, and for Jordan and Egypt, that could create other problems. It's not just, the Palestinians coming in, but how do you provide aid for this many people? How do you incorporate them into your country politically? What kind of representation do they have in the government? What kind of rights do they have? Are they going to be treated as normal citizens or second? These are all very important issues that of course need to be addressed. But more importantly for these countries, taking in the Palestinians is facilitating a genocide of the Palestinian people. And so for them to do this, it's stabbing the Palestinians in the back. And that's why they're going to be so opposed to it. Now, also, their native populations, I think, particularly Jordan, I think majority of the people who live there are actually Palestinians. In Egypt are a large population, very sympathetic to the Palestinians. They don't want to see their governments do this. And there's a possibility that their governments would face a lot of internal dissent if they went down this road. The other issue that they have, that these governments have, though, is that may be an issue down the road, right? Are your people going to rise up? Will you be able to quash the protest, or are they going to overthrow you? The other thing here is so much of this is incorporated in the U.S. aid. These countries, the governments in Egypt and Jordan rely so heavily on American aid that if we pull the plug, if we start, threatening sanctions and tariffs on goods, leaving Egypt and other economic penalties, that could very well cause these governments to collapse as well. And so they may see the threat of the U.S. pulling aid as actually being too great and a more immediate threat. And so I don't think it's impossible that Trump is able to bully Arab states into taking the Palestinians, particularly if he could increase the number of countries taking the Palestinians from two, just Egypt and Jordan, which would mean from Gaza alone, over 1 million each. But Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, maybe Qatar, increase the number of countries taking in the Palestinians. Remember, very early on in this conflict, the Netanyahu administration was talking with Chad and Rwanda and the Congo about paying them to take in Palestinians. And so if they spread them out enough, then it's going to be a much smaller population entering each of these countries. And in that case, they may be more willing to do it because, they're only a very small piece of the genocide. And even if they resist it and opted out, well, it would still probably happen anyways. And so I think there's a real possibility that Trump is actually going to be able to bully these Arab countries, these African countries, into taking a large number of Palestinians. And don't forget that the situation in Syria is a complete mess and completely chaotic. And maybe we could force the government in Damascus, the Jolani government, to take in the Palestinians. Maybe Israel will see an opportunity to stick them in Syrian territory that is now occupied by Israel. And of course, the U.S. owns and has 2,000 troops in a large portion of Syria that's controlled by us and our proxy force, the Kurds. And so what if we dump them there? What if we get the Iraqi government to take some Palestinians? And these are all things that I think the Trump administration is going to see as a possibility and going down this road towards ethnic cleansing. Now, one other point that Trump makes in the middle there that I think is very, very important is he's talking about the destruction of Gaza, and bringing this up and talking about it is really meaningful as the president. Now, this isn't meant to, blunt anything that he's necessarily saying in his comments here, talking about the ethnic cleansing, talking about the genocide, but that Trump is bringing up this issue in front of Netanyahu, I think is important. Now, let's move on to the second clip we have of Trump here.
I don't think people should be going back to Gaza. I think that Gaza has been very unlucky for them. They've lived like hell. They lived like you're living in hell. Gaza is not a place for people to be living. And the only reason they want to go back, and I believe this strongly, is because they have no alternative. What's the alternative? Go where? There's no other alternative. If they had an alternative, they'd much rather not go back to Gaza and live in a beautiful alternative that's safe.
So this is, I think, the most absurd part of Trump's thinking. And I really hope that somebody in his administration gets a hold of him and lets him know that this really isn't the case. I think maybe some of his advisors, maybe Benjamin Netanyahu, was able to convince him that the Palestinians would be happy in beautiful communities in the Sinai. Like this is some kind of real estate deal in the United States where he could, look at some very poor housing that's in disrepair and give the homeowners a generous offer, and they'll be, happy to go live somewhere else. That's not what we're talking about here. This is far more significant to the Palestinian people than just looking for somewhere else to live. They're talking about giving up their homeland. Essentially, in generations, Palestine, the Palestinians will entirely fade away. And as all refugee communities more or less do, they just become assimilated in the new country. And so that's going to take away what is Palestine. Any claim to historic Palestine will go away if they accept it and are allowed to leave. And this is something that I don't think Trump understands as he's talking about this yesterday, is what is going to happen when the Palestinians refuse to leave. He said something really interesting in the first clip, that there's tunnels under Gaza and there's a lot of bombs in Gaza that are unexploded. And he kind of says this as a reason that the Palestinians need to leave, that these unexploded bombs and these tunnels are a threat to the Palestinian people. They're not. Those unexploded bombs and those tunnels are a threat to the Israelis, or whatever force moves into Gaza to occupy that territory. This is, I don't know if Trump really understands what it means. Before this conflict on October 7th, apparently, Hamas had gotten about 80% of their weapons from using dud munitions that Israel had dropped in previous bombing campaigns of Gaza. It's not from weapons smuggled in. And so, of course, if Hamas is getting access to now all these bombs that are, I'm sure, littering the Gaza Strip in record numbers. I saw just today, and I see these clips not infrequently on Twitter now, especially now that people are allowed to move around the Gaza Strip. We're able to return to northern Gaza. There's just landmines and all kinds of explosives, unexploded bombs and things like that on the side of the road that people are videoing. And so, of course, Hamas is going to get their hands on these weapons. They're going to, take out the explosive material. They're going to turn it into RPGs and other kind of weapons, and they're going to use it again. If it's the Americans, if it's the Israelis, if it's the Egyptians, whoever it is, whoever is occupying Gaza is going to be on the receiving end of these weapons. And so, I hope Trump understands what he's talking about getting into here, because there is going to be a significant resistance from Hamas when it comes to not allowing this ethnic cleansing to happen, but also from the Palestinian people. I think the people of Gaza feel like the past 16 months has been a trial, and that they have won, that they have met their goals, that they have withstood the most atrocious thing that Israel could throw at them. Tens of thousands of bombs dropped on one of the most densely populated enclaves on earth. There were people who were living in tent camp cities who had 2,000-pound bombs on them. Their hospitals were destroyed. Their schools were shut down and turned into shelters. And then they were bombed, even as the children were playing soccer games. Children were killed in their hospital beds. Babies were starved to death and froze to death in the winter. People, there were no bathrooms, there was no sewage, there was no water, there was no food. And the Palestinian people resisted Israel. And once they were able to, they returned to where their homes once stood. And so now, if the U.S. Marines are deployed to Gaza and they are telling the people of northern Gaza that you now have to leave this strip, what happens when, maybe they just have a tent on a former pile of rubble? But unlike Donald Trump, what he thinks, they don't want to go live in some house in the Egyptian Sinai that in reality we all know is not going to be some beautiful oasis. It's going to be, essentially a shanty town with really poor construction that is all going to fall apart as soon as the cameras turn off. And so they're not going to accept this. And what happens when instead of allowing themselves to be arrested, they start throwing rocks at the American soldiers and they resist. It becomes every single Palestinian resists and refuses to go. How many of them is Donald Trump willing to kill to carry out this ethnic cleansing for Benjamin Netanyahu? This is absolutely horrific what is being discussed now by the Americans. Now, again, of course, it's a good thing that Trump is mentioning how horrific the conditions are in Gaza. The disgusting part about this is he's actually sitting next to the man who caused the situation to be this way in the Strip. And Netanyahu is just sitting there grinning and smiling the entire time, understanding that he got away with the crime of the century, that he was able to reduce the Gaza Strip to rubble. He was able to make it unlivable with no expectation that he would rebuild it for the civilian population there. And now, rather than the Americans punishing the Israelis, we're going to help them complete this ethnic cleansing. We're going to not only clear out the Palestinian people, but I'm sure in some way, shape, or form, the American taxpayer is ultimately going to be the ones paying for the construction of the new housing for the Palestinians. Even if we get the Saudis to build it, we'll only allow the Saudis will only build it if the Americans give them all kinds of other benefits, maybe nuclear technology, things like that Riyadh really has their eye on. So if those statements by Trump weren't disgusting enough, it gets even worse at the second presser of the day. So let's go ahead and play this next clip from Donald Trump and Netanyahu.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
This is absolutely crazy. I'm not sure what else I have to add. I mean, Donald Trump is, in a way, living in an unreality here. In a sense, he's acknowledging something that the political class in Washington refused to acknowledge under the Biden administration, which is if there's not a significant change in Israeli policy, the Palestinian people will not be able to survive in Gaza. The infrastructure has all been destroyed, which means significant amount of construction material needs to enter the Strip. And the Palestinians are not going to be displaced. They're not stupid. They understand that if they leave, it's not going to be a temporary displacement. It's going to be permanent. And so they're going to refuse to leave the Strip. They might, be willing to move to a temporary location while, say, one city is constructed or something like that, but they're not going to be willing to leave the Strip. It may be not even willing to leave the cities entirely, and it should be, aid entering, but really give the Palestinian people jobs and allow them to reconstruct the own Strip. That way they start to have income and dignity, and then allow, goods to enter Gaza so people could start buying and an economy can form. The reconstruction could happen largely facilitated and run by the Palestinians in Gaza, but they're never going to allow that to happen because Israel didn't eliminate Hamas, and it's going to continue to control Gaza. Trump is going to say time and time again, we heard from him yesterday, and members of his administrations and Republicans love to say that Hamas, along with Hezbollah and others, but Hamas is at a historic weak point. But that's not the assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. And of course, in this case, the U.S. intelligence community is going to want to repeat the Israeli narrative. And the U.S. intelligence community is saying that Hamas has recruited at least as many fighters that they have lost. And who knows how many new recruits Hamas has generated as people who have lived for 15, 16 months under this cruel Israeli bombardment and siege, once they're able to return to their homes and see they have nothing left, find that their, parents, their children, their siblings, their grandparents, babies were all just killed in these cruel ways, and their bodies left to rot and decompose of the rubbles of their home. How many people is that going to drive to take up arms against the Israelis, and Hamas is only going to be stronger. So Hamas is not historically weak. It's not in a weakened state. There's going to be a significant resistance with Israel and Hamas and fighting against this. Now, what Trump is saying here, that we're going to own this, is absolutely insane. I don't know what he's talking about there, unless, he's making the statement as we're taking ownership as in responsibility. But the situation is absolutely horrific, and the United States really just needs to put pressure on Israel to allow in construction material so the Palestinians can rebuild the strip. But since the Israelis won't allow that, then what's going to happen to the Palestinians? And I mean, that's a real question that's going to have to be wrestled with. And again, hopefully Washington goes the humane way in allowing Palestinians to rebuild the strip and not the current direction, which seems to be the ethnic cleansing of the strip. Now, following Trump's remarks yesterday, they got a lot of attention. The mainstream media even was up in arms about this. Even during the presser, there was, some resistance to Trump from the press. And so that was interesting to see. But I do want to move on and talk about some comments made by the press secretary the following day. So let's play the first clip.
When the president announced his taking over Gaza policy yesterday, was Netanyahu aware of this, and what was his reaction when Trump presented that idea to him?
I won't get ahead of the president's discussions or negotiations on your first question about what would be offered. I think the president's made it clear that he expects these nations in the region to step up and to accept Palestinian refugees who will be temporarily relocated for the rebuilding of Gaza. As for whether Prime Minister Netanyahu was aware before the president's remarks, he was indeed. I wasn't present for that reaction. But again, this is something the president has been socializing and thinking about for quite some time.
So, important there, doubling down on we're going to pressure Arab states to take them in. I do think there's going to be a shift in the rhetoric from the White House. They're going to understand that anytime you are talking about the permanent displacement of the Palestinians, that no country can accept that in the region. And on top of that, it's going to stiffen the Palestinian resistance against ever leaving Gaza. And so I think they're going to try to stay away from the permanent rhetoric and just stay on temporary. But I also want to play this clip because a lot was made of Netanyahu's demeanor as Trump was making this statement, which was certainly interesting. And maybe it was the rhetoric, the way that Trump said it. It's very Trumpian, of course, but that was interesting. And here we have the press secretary just confirming that Netanyahu did see it before, and it's not as if this was the first time he was hearing this proposal from Donald Trump, which I do think is important to note, just because a lot of people are saying that this was some move by Trump to try to, rein in the Israelis, which I really didn't understand. But they were saying that in context of Trump was saying this just off the cuff. And it does seem to be that this was something discussed before. So let's go ahead and play the second clip we have from the press secretary today.
The president yesterday used the word permanent for permanently resettle Palestinians. I hear you saying temporarily today. Is that a shift or a specific change that you want to highlight? And my second question is, yesterday he spoke about the U.S. owning Gaza. Who owns Gaza now, and how would the U.S. acquire ownership?
Well, Gaza is currently run by Iranian-backed terrorists in the Middle East, Hamas, who we all agree, I think everybody in the region agrees, that can no longer stand. Just look at the events of October 7th and the events since. And the president, again, is committed to rebuilding the region for all people who want to return to it once it is no longer a demolition site, and it's a place where people can actually live and thrive in harmony, as he said last night. His words, not mine. Daniel.
Permanent versus temporarily resettle? Can you just clarify
The president
that?
has made it clear that they need to be temporarily relocated out of Gaza for the rebuilding of this effort. Again, it's a demolition site right now. It's not a livable place for any human being. And I think it's actually quite evil to suggest that people should live in such dire conditions.
Okay, so that last comment, of course, is just the most striking part, that the people who aren't supporting the ethnic cleansing are now the evil ones. The ones who are saying that, as the Palestinians are, we don't want to leave our homes, we want to stay in Gaza. Those are the evil people. This is just, the worst kind of propaganda that they're trying to push. And we hear it from the Israelis too. This whole time, Israelis who are calling for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza are saying that this is voluntary emigration. This is a humanitarian move to help the Palestinians live in peace somewhere else, which, of course, it's just the absolute worst way to conduct a genocide. But, notice in her statement there, she's not 100% willing to move away from the permanent remark. And again, I think they're just going to keep the emphasis on temporary. So next up, I have a clip that I wanted to play. And I think that this is important to talk about, just because I want to get into Trump's decision making, not only to understand why he made the decision he made and announced what he announced, that the U.S. would take ownership of the Gaza Strip, drive out the Palestinians, but also, to understand behind it just for future, what else are we going to get from Donald Trump? And so I want to play this clip of Trump and Netanyahu discussing October 7th.
The Israelis have stood strong and united in the face of an enemy that has kidnapped, tortured, raped, and slaughtered innocent men, women, children, and even little babies.
On that infamous day, Hamas monsters savagely murdered 1,200 innocent people, including more than 40 Americans. They beheaded men, they raped women, they burnt babies alive, and they took 251 people hostage.
All right, so I think this clip is important to show that Donald Trump has bought into the Israeli narrative of October 7th. Now, of course, I don't want to get take away entirely that there were atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, but the very worst of the Israeli claims, the mass rape, the beheaded babies, the burnt babies, are all just untrue. One baby was killed on October 7th. Absolutely horrific. That baby was shot. That baby was not, burned, cooked in an oven, as the Israelis claim. There were not 40 beheaded babies. There was not mass rape. There is no proof that anybody was raped on October 7th. It doesn't mean that Hamas didn't kill innocent civilians, that they didn't kill people that they certainly shouldn't have, that they didn't conduct attacks on civilian gatherings. These are all war crimes. These are all awful and evil things to do. However, what I believe happened in the meeting between Netanyahu and Trump is that Trump was probably moved by images. So I have this article from Jewish Currents explaining one of the things that was going to happen in the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu. And the headline is, Donald Trump to watch raw footage of Hamas atrocities before Netanyahu meeting. And in the article, they write, U.S. President Donald Trump will watch firsthand footage of the October 7th massacre ahead of the meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A report by Ynet news outlet said Trump will watch the film after his Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, was shot by the footage last weekend and decided the president should see it too. And so it's important to remember that during the first Trump administration, his initial, when he came into office, in the first 2 months he was in office, he was actually pro-engaging with the Syrian government. He saw an opportunity to work with the Syrian government against terrorist groups in Syria, like Abu Muammar Mohammed al-Jolani's group, HTS, which now rules Syria, the Islamic State, which at its time was near its peak in Syria in having control. And Donald Trump saw an opportunity to work with Assad. And then what happened? There was a false flag, Syrian chemical weapons attack in Syria, and his daughter Ivanka Trump took pictures of what she said were people that were killed by chemical weapons used by Bashar al-Assad, and then Trump decided to bomb the Syrian government, and that really reversed his Syria policy throughout his administration. I think it was a real shift in time, and so I think here once again we see Trump being able to be moved by images and by videos, and this isn't necessarily a terrible quality, that at least he's a humane enough person to look at these videos and to be appalled by civilians being killed. I remember a story from the Biden administration when a doctor brought Biden some pictures from the Gaza Strip, showing him of, I think kids being killed by sniper fire. And Biden said, I've seen those before, and dismissed it. I just hope that somebody now needs to get Donald Trump some of the images and some of the videos that have been taking place in the Gaza Strip of the children being killed by Israeli sniper fire, bombs being dropped on civilian targets, including things like children's soccer games, children being blown apart, crushed to death by the rubble. Donald Trump should see that as well, and hopefully that will again invoke his humanity to take some action here. Next up, I want to move to a clip of Donald Trump talking about the number of Palestinians killed and saying that we're going to remove all of them. So can we play this next clip?
How many people are you thinking about?
All of them. I mean, we're talking about probably 1.7 million people, 1.7 million, maybe 1.8 million. But I think all of them. I think they'll be resettled in areas where they can live a beautiful life and not be worried about dying every day.
So, two things here. Trump is again saying that we're going to remove all the Palestinians from Gaza. I think it's significant that this is something Trump is saying time and time again. It's not something he once thought of off the cuff. And again, we talked about this in the past on the show, that Donald Trump had estimated there was between 1.7 and 1.8 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And that is significantly lower than the number of Palestinians who are living in Gaza pre-October 7th, which was between 2.2 and 2.3 million. Now, I know there have been some Palestinians who have left the Strip, either in Israeli detention, although a lot of them have been returned after, months, if not a year, in Israeli detention facilities. But also, there's a few hundred Palestinian children who have lost arms and legs and who are orphans, so they have no one to take care of them, and they now live at a camp in Qatar. And so there have been a few thousand Palestinians, maybe 10,000 or so, who have been able to get out either for relief reasons. There was a journalist who left because he thought he was being targeted by the Israelis. Other people have gotten out of Gaza. And so the population has decreased somewhat for that reason. But we are still talking about here, going from a population of 2.2 million to 1.8 to 1.7 million. So that means between 400,000 and 500,000 people dead. I mean, these are absolutely horrific numbers. Now, those numbers would not be out of line with some estimates that people have suggested throughout the war, and also historically what we have seen in combat zones, where for every violent death, you end up with 4 to 5 times the number of nonviolent deaths. And so if you say have 80,000 people who have died from the Israeli bombs, from Israeli gunfire, being hit or run over by Israeli tanks, which the Israelis have done quite a bit. I mean, what a horrific way to kill a human being. But they've run over people in tanks, and the Israeli soldiers have actually bragged about that. So, if the number of dead killed that way is 80,000, then you're talking about, 4 to 5 times that number as the number of people killed overall by, the indirect deaths, starvation, people who would have been able to go to the hospital and have life-saving care, but couldn't. Maybe people who had a diabetic episode because they couldn't get a hold of their insulin and end up dying for this reason. All these other indirect deaths is oftentimes many, many times worse. And so, last here on the Trump comments from yesterday, I want to play this clip about Trump saying that, this is really a gift to the Palestinians. We're doing them a favor.
Peter?
Would Palestinians have the right to return to Gaza if they left while the rebuilding was happening?
It would be my hope that we could do something really nice, really good, where they wouldn't want to return. Why would they want to return? The place has been hell. It's been one of the meanest, toughest places on earth. And right now, I've seen every picture from every angle, better than if I were there. And nobody can live there. You can't live there. So if we can build them through massive amounts of money supplied by other people, very rich nations, and they're willing to supply it. If we can build something for them in one of the countries, and it could be Jordan, and it could be Egypt, it could be other countries, and you could build 4 or 5 or 6 areas. It doesn't have to be one area, but you take certain areas and you build really good quality housing, like a beautiful town, like someplace where they can live and not die. Because Gaza is a guarantee that they're going to end up dying. The same thing's going to happen again. It's happened over and over again, and it's going to happen again as sure as you're standing there, Peter. So I hope that we could do something where they wouldn't want to go back. Who would want to go back? They've experienced nothing but death and destruction. Who would want to?
So disturbing that Donald Trump looks at it this way. Again, this is so much more to the Palestinians than this just being their home. This is truly their homeland, their culture, their identity that they are clinging here when they cling to the Gaza Strip. They are not trying to, simply just avoid having to move to a different county in your state or something like that. They're being relocated away from their homeland. And again, if they're divided up into all these little communities in all these different Arab states, then really there's never going to be a Palestinian people again, and generation after generation is going to fade away. This is what we're talking about here. The American people funding, aiding, finishing off the Israeli elimination of the Palestinian people. And that could happen under the Trump administration. I mean, for as much as everybody said, Joe Biden will be remembered as Genocide Joe, it seems that Donald Trump is really trying to steal the crown of genocider in chief from Joe Biden. And I mean, not only are the Israelis doing this in Gaza, look at how they have their sights set on the West Bank. And once again, now the Israelis have the precedent, right? Once they destroy the town, once they reduce it to rubble, as they're doing right now to the Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, then they could go to the Americans. Well, people got no place to go to now. So do the humane thing and build them a nice city somewhere else so they could go live there. And again, of course, it's going to be cheap construction. And in the end, it's just going to all crumble and fall apart. And the Palestinian people are going to be left in the absolute worst conditions. Now, of course, that this is all said, that Trump says all of this while sitting next to Benjamin Netanyahu, when he says, if we rebuild it, this is just going to happen again and again and again. Well, the man who does this again and again and again to Gaza is sitting right next to him. I mean, this is Netanyahu's fourth, fifth major Israeli bombing campaign of Gaza. What is he doing? Why are we not reining this man in and stopping this rather than simply cleaning up his mess and finishing off for him? This should be seen as a real loss for the Israelis. They reduced Gaza to rubble and the Palestinians remained. They were able to go back to their homes. Hamas remained. And now Trump is saying that I'm going to come in, I'm going to resolve this issue for you. Now, before we finish off today's show, I do want to move on and talk about Trump's policy towards Iran. This is really an update from the last episode of the show where we were getting into this. First off here, we had this article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. President Trump signs order to reinstate maximum pressure on Iran. So what Dave writes here is maximum pressure refers to the Iran policy of the previous Trump administration, with involved withdrawing from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, imposing crippling sanctions on the Islamic Republic, and assassinating Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. President Biden essentially continued the Trump administration policy and imposed additional sanctions on Iran. But over the years, Iran found oil markets in Asia that were not afraid of U.S. sanctions. And so while we hear from the Republicans time and time again, oh, the Biden administration was weak on Iran and they allowed the Iranians to bypass U.S. sanctions when we are just about to destroy the Iranian economy, and then the Iranians would have had to come to the table on their hands and knees and begged the Americans for relief and agreed to every last point we wanted, essentially forgo all sovereignty of the Iranians, and that they were willing to come to the table. And this really isn't what happened. I do think they can point to the Biden administration in particular, the effort to isolate the Kremlin after Russia invaded Ukraine, and the efforts to cripple the Russian economy, I think really started to open up the global South in general to understanding that at any time the Americans could come in and absolutely devastate and wreck your country. And so they were just more and more countries were willing to do business with countries on the official list of enemy nations, which has long included Iran. But once it included the Russian economy in whole, and in a lot of ways, the Chinese economy under Trump, all the economic penalties he put on Beijing, and so many other countries being on the list at this point, facing these massive, extensive U.S. sanctions, Iran was able to do more and more business with other countries in the global South, and it made the sanctions less effective. But that's not necessarily to say that the Biden administration didn't attempt to enforce the sanctions, or that the Trump administration is really going to be able to do anything to increase pressure on Iran via sanctions. And so Trump signed this order, and then he made a couple interesting statements while he was signing it. So let's go ahead and play the first clip.
So what kind of deal would you be prepared to
Well,
make
we're going to
with Iran?
see. I mean, we're going to see. They cannot have a nuclear weapon. With me, it's very simple. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. We don't want to be tough on Iran. We don't want to be tough on anybody, but they just can't have a nuclear weapon.
So it's interesting, during Trump's statement, he's saying, I don't really want to sign this order. People are telling me to sign this order. I hope I don't have to, put these maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. Maybe it's possible that Trump is saying that because he understands that there's now a whole lot of additional economic pressure the U.S. could apply to Iran. Or maybe this is, kind of the Trumpian negotiation tactics where he's trying to leave the Iranians open a window to see, what happened with Colombia, Venezuela, Canada, Mexico, where if you try to make a deal, if you try to make a compromise with Donald Trump, then he's willing to take off some sanctions, to take off some economic penalties. And so if Trump is saying that his only issue with Iran is Iran not developing a nuclear weapon, then that's something that Tehran could certainly sign on to. However, we hear, Trump and other people in his administration frequently say that Iran does all these other nefarious and malign things in the Middle East, like bat these evil groups like the Houthis in Yemen, or Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. And for that reason, that's the reason in part why he said that we couldn't stay in the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Obama negotiated that did prevent Iran from ever developing a nuclear weapon, and that Trump got out of in 2018. And so, Iran isn't developing a nuclear weapon, and this actually seems to be something that Trump recognizes. And so throughout this signing statement, Trump is saying the Iranians can't get a nuclear weapon. That's why I'm going to put on sanctions. But the last thing he says is really interesting. So let's play this final clip.
Or a relationship with Iran, and would you?
I'd love to have a good relationship with everybody. They can't have a nuclear weapon. That was the only thing that was very important. They can't have a nuclear weapon. Beyond that, it would be very tough if they insist on doing that. They have some of their leadership, I can tell you right now, and maybe you know it, maybe you don't, but there are many people at the top ranks of Iran that do not want to have a nuclear weapon just for that very reason.
So, this is very important because American politicians do not say that there are people within the Iranian government, and, this includes the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, who do not want a nuclear weapon. And so for Trump to say we have to sanction Iran because we have to prevent them from getting a nuke is all within this Israeli narrative that we constantly hear, that Israel's almost there. They're 95% way. Iran, is 95% of the way to getting a nuclear bomb. So we have to do something about it. We have to act soon. We have to put on these sanctions. And here Trump is kind of admitting the truth, which is not only does Iran not have a nuclear weapon, not only are they not building a nuclear weapon, they don't have a nuclear weapons program. They're not looking into it. This is confirmed by the CIA. But the Iranian leadership doesn't actually even want to build or go down the path to getting a nuclear weapon. And so, maybe this is, in a way, Trump trying to open up a window for negotiations. That's really what I hope. And then, of course, after he made that statement and he signed that order, then he puts out this post on Truth Social, which just, makes everything so much more interesting. He says, I want Iran to be a great and successful country, but one that cannot have nuclear weapons. Reports that the United States, working in conjunction with Israel, is going to blow Iran into smithereens are greatly exaggerated. He says that in all caps. And of course, when he says that, the reports where those are coming from are from Donald Trump. Those are statements that he made that, we could blow Iran to smithereens. And so for him to then go to this is really exaggerated, it is very interesting. Then he continues, I would much prefer a verified nuclear peace agreement which will let Iran peacefully grow and prosper. We should start working immediately and have a big Middle East celebration when it's signed and completed. God bless the Middle East. And of course, what he's talking about here is the Iran nuclear deal, the deal that Donald Trump got out of in 2018, a deal that had the international watchdog, the IAEA, a body effectively controlled by the United States, having unprecedented access to any country's nuclear program that they had in Iran. Cameras, monitors everywhere to constantly make sure that the Iranian nuclear program was a limited civilian nuclear program. They didn't even have a full energy program because of the caps put on by the JCPOA. And Trump was propagandized by mainly the Israel lobby to get out of this. This is a lot of the influence that Sheldon and Miriam Adelson had during the first Trump administration. Again, looking at parallels, looking at Trump's thinking repeating, we're seeing that this time just Miriam Adelson wanting Trump to cleanse Palestine of the Palestinians. And here we have Trump saying that this is something that he's moving towards. Well, in his first administration, we had the Adelsons telling him to get out of the JCPOA, and he does it even though the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal from 2015, is exactly the policy that Donald Trump wants for Iran. And so that he withdrew from that is just a complete joke and a complete disaster. And so who knows what's going on with Trump's Iran policy. There seems to be a lot of fluidity and change in it right now. We'll certainly continue to update it and talk about it on future episodes of the Kyle Anzalone Show. So be sure everybody take a moment to subscribe to the channel. If you are watching, we have a few hundred people right now watching live on X. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Go ahead and repost, like, share the show from there, but also head on over to the YouTube channel and go ahead and subscribe. That way you don't miss one of our future episodes, and we'll be back with another episode soon.